Hey, welcome everybody from all walks of life, and thank you for being here. Just want to remind you that anyone and everyone is welcome to the Discord. The goal for this community is to sort of promote disagreement and conversation that's paired with human compassion and empathy, because at the end of the day, we are all sharing this human experience together, and I think it's possible to not navigate these conversations while keeping that in mind. So today should be a really fun conversation comparing and contrasting sort of these two political systems, namely communism and libertarianism. I have two returning guests, and they're both amazing conversationalists. So without further ado, Josh and Dana, welcome to the den.
Thank you. Good to be here again.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I really appreciate you guys coming, and especially your patience and conversational skills. I feel like you both practice that really well. So I want to sort of give a preamble to this conversation a little bit. You know, I think all three of us are fairly educated and well read on a lot of different things, including politics. But as far as I know, none of us are necessarily experts in like actual economic study. Is that correct from both of you?
Yeah,
Yeah, correct.
definitely far
Okay.
from an expert.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've
So
I've taken some undergrad econ classes, but certainly nothing expert worthy.
okay. Cool. Sounds good. Yeah, just want to put it out there that this, I wouldn't say it's just only opinion, maybe somewhat of an educated opinion from everyone, but and then I'll sort of just be playing on the fence in this conversation as kind of the agnostic, because genuinely the past few years as I've been getting into philosophy and whatnot, I've been trying to navigate through these systems, and I really can't quite get a grasp on what I think would actually be best. So it's a genuine agnosticism from me. Um, and please, if I end up rambling too much, either of you, like, I know you guys are so well behaved and have great manners, but I tend to like, start going down little rabbit trails and just taking my rambles all over the place. Please interrupt me. I won't feel bad. I tend to just preamble like I'm currently doing right now. So yeah, please interrupt me if you have to. Uh, and so just to start us off, I want to put down two agreements that I think all three of us are on the same page. And again, if there's any even just slightly nuanced disagreements, please let me know. But the first would be like civil liberties, pretty much. The tolerance and acceptance for all types of life to have rights and exist, religious freedom, gay marriage, right to trans medical care, just all the different civil rights. Are we all on that page?
Yes, totally.
Yep, absolutely.
Cool. Okay. And then yeah, in fact, it's kind of interesting, Dana, because there are some people like right-wing media online who claim to be libertarian, but then they sort of are opposed to these things, and it's like
Mhm.
literally in the name to about liberty, so it's kind of weird.
Yeah, there's been quite the scourge of, especially a lot of right-wing extremists claiming libertarianism without actually knowing what that means. And then they end up contradicting themselves whenever they go out and speak or go out and talk. Um, what libertarians actually believe is letting the individual live their life as fully and as unhindered as possible. But when it comes to things like healthcare, for example, those right wing extremists that claim to be libertarian are on a very different page.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to put that out there because I'm sure there's some people who hear that word and they just automatically attach it to exactly what you said, these sort of right-wing extreme people, and I agree with you. It's like baked into the word that like liberty is the utmost importance. So And so this all sort of leads into the next agreement I think that we'll all have, and it's I guess this anti-authoritarian that I hold to, and I think it's obvious that like most people would say we need some level of authoritarian governance through like laws, whatever that might look like. Um, but basically, I would like it to be the least amount authoritarian as possible while still maintaining a good system.
Yeah, I'm fully on board there as well. And a lot of libertarians, what they have to realize is anarchy and libertarianism are not synonymous with one another. I think a lot of people have the misconception that libertarians are just for total anarchy when it's has to be no. There's still got to be a system in place. There still has to be some control, but it needs to be limited in scope.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's something that I would totally agree with as well. I think that this is almost certainly going to come up during our conversation. We're probably going to talk about the likes of Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin and all of those. And those are certainly not people who I'm going to defend. That is a degree of authoritarianism that is way over the top and absolutely not acceptable, at least in my mind. And so I think that there is absolutely a world in which communism, at least the way that I view it, the way that Karl Marx views it, is very much possible without going through a brutal authoritarian system, like you said, in places like communist China or the USSR. So, yes, I would totally agree.
Cool. All right. Yeah, I figured we would all pretty much be on the same page there. And to be honest, like that's one of the more important things to me anyway, especially the civil liberties and stuff. Obviously, economic systems and whatnot also matter toward civil liberties, but um, I do think too that maybe throughout this conversation we all should be somewhat aware of um, there's like there's idealistic versions of systems, and then there's like the worst failure of each system. And then in between that, there's usually what actually happens practically by implementing a system. Like the ideal is what you strive for, but you don't usually get to that. So I only want to point it out because it can be tricky to like say start criticizing the worst failure of what a system can be without giving a charitable listen to the idealistic version of that same system. Um, so yeah, that's just something I wanted to get out of the way. Um,
Yeah.
okay, so I guess I'll just do sort of my basic critique of each thing, and then maybe more will pop up when you both lay out your positions. But essentially, the critique I have for both system rests on the same thing, and maybe this is something that just can't be avoided in any system, and so it's moot anyway. But really, the greedy nature of humanity, I think, is sort of a problem with all of this. So when it comes to like completely free open market with like little to no taxes for individuals, I feel like it can lead to accumulation of wealth into certain corporations or families and passed down generationally. And then the accumulation of that wealth eventually will lead to more powerful influence on politics and everything else. Sort of like, I mean, it's kind of like what we see now in our system. Like you have these huge wealthy corporations that's accumulated a lot of the wealth and don't care to redistribute it in any meaningful way. On the other hand, like, so the attempt to redistribute the society's production in a more fair way, like through communism or socialism, I think can easily lead to corruption, as in the sense that I feel like we would always need some sort of agency or workers to manage this redistribution. And I don't really see a way how we can ensure that the power of this position to redistribute wouldn't go into the wrong hands and essentially redistribute the wealth unequally again and sort of create these powerful entities and influence the politics as well. Um, Yeah, I think that's basically it. So why don't we start with Josh, if you want to, either way, if you want to respond to the critique first or just lay out your ideal system.
Yeah, yeah, sure. I guess I'll kind of do a bit of a mix of both. But I guess I should preface this by saying, like we said earlier, I am by no means an expert. I'm going to make mistakes and say things that are wrong. So please call me out on that if you guys hear anything that is incorrect. But with that being said, basically, so I do consider myself a communist. However, I think the really important caveat to include in that is that I'm not what I would call like an immediate communist. I'm not looking for like a Les Miserables style revolution on the streets of the United States that's going to completely overthrow our current system of governance in the next like 10, 20, 30, even 50 or 100 years. This is something that's going to be a very slow change that takes progress over a period of decades, over a period of generations. So, first, I think in our lifetimes, the ideal system that I would like to see is something a little bit more along the lines of what an Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders might argue for, which would be more of a democratic socialist system. So I think that's a lot more achievable within the United States, where you maintain a democratic system of government and you still maintain capitalism. You just have a more heavily regulated capitalism. Because even according to Marx, in order to achieve communism, you have to go through a period of capitalism as well. So I also want to, for a second, sing some of the praises of capitalism, because I think it actually does have a place in society, and societies need to go through a capitalistic stage in order to progress to the next thing. So I think most of us are probably speaking from an iPhone right now, or using AirPods or some other device, and those are capitalistic inventions. It's through innovation and competition that those things have happened, and it would not be possible for those things to happen, or it would be much more difficult for those innovations to happen without the capitalistic system that we've seen for the past couple hundred years. Now, with that being said, I just don't think that it's a sustainable model in the long term. It's just a bridge to move on to the next thing. I think what we're starting to see now are the consequences of late stage capitalism, where basically we're going into a system of more monopolies, where you have companies like Vanguard and BlackRock that are slowly taking over and controlling many more sectors of the economy. It's raising the cost of housing, it's raising the cost of living in general, and it's just not sustainable for so many people. So, with that being said, I think what I would like to see is a system where we move to democratic socialism, where everybody's needs are taken care of and you have a much stronger social safety net, and where that eventually, over a period of decades, slowly gets replaced with a smaller and smaller government that eventually leads to the means of production being controlled entirely by the worker. Now, that's something that would have to take place over a very long period of time, but we have to get through capitalism to get there. So that's my ultimate vision for what we'd want to see, at least here in the United States and in Europe. But yeah, I think that's what I would start out with.
Cool. All right. And then I guess we can just have Dana do his and then sort of get into criticisms afterward.
Okay. So I may vary quite a bit from your typical libertarian. I consider myself a left-leaning libertarian, meaning that I am all for having a social safety net, having government programs that could potentially help people, and ultimately move us forward, with the caveat that they have to be voluntary. They can't be, in my mind, we can't compel compassion. Compassion is something that somebody does freely of their out of their own free will. Now, going back to the market discussion and where we are seeing what we're labeling as late stage capitalism, I think a lot of the problems that we've had with like generational wealth, people hoarding that wealth as well, is a lot of ties between those free markets, powerful corporations, and government through systems that we see, like lobbying, for example. And this is one of the big things where I may differ from a lot of different libertarians, but personally, I would like to see heavy anti-lobbying legislation put into place. Because if you have these large corporations that have hoarded all this wealth, and we are in this capitalistic system where money equals power, as long as those that have the most money are able to give our politicians, our government money freely, and vice versa, we end up in this kind of system where the few select what is best for the few, and the rest of the population is just left to their own devices. They're not even in the equation; they're not even considered. So, anti-lobbying legislation, I think, is one way to start repairing this free market system that we have in place, as well as I've been lately thinking about distinction, and I don't know if this is right by any means, but I've been separating the ideals of what I would call free market capitalism and just free market enterprise in general, where free market capitalism is a company's only goal in their existence is how much money can we make for ourselves, how much money can we make for our stockholders, whereas free market enterprise, a company would say, for example, like, okay, we've accumulated this money, what can we now do to push the bounds, what can we do to be better, what can we do with this money to push us forward, to move us forward. And I think, especially with the lobbying issues that we have nowadays, we have a lot of old companies that should have gone under due to fair competition decades ago, but they've been propped up. They've been given bailouts by the government, by the people that they lobby to throughout the years, and they've been propped up and kept in place. And we see the idealism that was once at the root of these companies starting to fade, and people coming in that are more concerned with how much money this company is going to make and how much money they can make for their shareholders, instead of pushing the bounds and innovating further for the greater good of humanity.
Yeah. Okay. So I kind of want to like let you two chat for a bit. If you guys have questions for each other, that is, and if not, then I've been writing things down as we go. Do either of you have like specific questions about the other system?
Hmm. I mean, I think the first thing I'd want to say off the bat is there's a lot of stuff that I actually agree with you on here. I think especially when it comes to regulation of lobbying and all of that, I would love to see. I know that it's very difficult to do with our current congressional system, but I would love to see a constitutional amendment to limit the amount of money that's put into campaigns, because normal people, everyday people who don't have a lot of money, should be able to have a voice in politics, and that is slowly going away with the existence of super PACs and lobbying and stuff like that. So I really agree with that. That's a really great thing. And I think as a self-described left-leaning libertarian, I think you and I are actually going to agree on a lot more things than we initially intended to, which I thought was probably going to happen through this conversation, because that kind of seems to be the theme of the discourse, Dan, is I think everybody comes away from the conversation realizing, oh, we have really similar goals.
Mhm.
We just have different ways of getting there. And I think we both want to see a better country. We both want to see a better world. So I guess my question for you would be to go more in depth on kind of what that free market enterprise would look like and what the government's role in that should be. If we should have more regulation on corporations, or if that's something that we should kind of be a little bit more laissez-faire with.
So when it comes down to regulation of bigger companies and what they're trying to achieve, it's going to play down to the at the most simplistic level is whose rights could I possibly be infringing upon if we're taking action to do this? So we've seen examples of like cities taking over small private businesses without the without the consent of the business owner, or taking over people's homes to build a freeway, for example, with those people getting absolutely no say. They are eventually paid out for what they want, but they really didn't have a choice in the matter. So it comes down to who, like, if they are able to operate without infringing upon the rights of others, um, especially if they disagree with the objective that they're trying to accomplish, right?
Mm.
That's down to the most simplistic level, what kind of governments there would have to be over those companies. Also, there would have to be, and this is my personal opinion coming out as well, there has to be some kind of environmental regulation. So we've seen for years upon years, like the oil industry, many different corporations just blatantly polluting, dumping waste into waterways that people rely on for drinking water. That has to be heavily regulated, I feel, just because that's another infringement upon other people's rights of being able to use a certain body of water or use public land, for example, with the expectation that it's safe and not going to be contaminated with any kind of toxic waste or whatever is left over with what these companies are trying to do.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's another thing that I would agree on as well. I think that that was even up until recently a GOP priority because Nixon was the one who started the EPA. So up until the last couple of decades, I think this is something that both parties have largely agreed on, and I'm glad that that's the basis that we can totally agree on as well. I think environmental regulations are hugely important, especially as we're staring down the barrel of cities like New York, Miami, Lagos, Jakarta getting flooded. That's it's totally something that we want to see heavily regulated. Um, so I guess what I would want to go into discussing next, unless Keaton had something else that he wanted to say for leading our conversation somewhere, I wanted to talk about kind of the difference between a profit motivated entity versus a how would I put this? So most businesses at the end of the day, no matter how heavily regulated they are still going to be profit motivated to get a return for their shareholders.
Mhm.
Versus a government entity is going to be more motivated by helping the people. At least in theory, that's what it should be.
Mhm.
So I wanted to discuss kind of, I'm trying to find the right way to phrase this, but
Uh,
essentially, if you want to put it in very basic terms, who we should trust more to have more of an impact on our lives. Because right now in the US, it seems that corporations have a little bit more control over what happens in our day to day life. So, do we want to leave that in the hands of somebody who's profit motivated, or do we want to leave that more in the hands of somebody who is trying to get votes and trying to get the majority of people on their side?
and I would argue that it would be a collaboration of both,
Okay.
to some extent. It
Yeah.
So the biggest difference that I see between somebody who's profit motivated and somebody who's actually motivated in solving a problem with the free market enterprise, obviously at the end of the day, you're going to have to make some kind of profit because you need to be able to pay your employees. You need to be able to expand out your facilities as you grow, um, and you need to ultimately take care of not just your customers but the people that are working for you, whether that be healthcare, leave, um, vacation time, what have you,
Mhm.
and using your finances to fill in the gaps for when you have somebody go on maternity or paternity leave. Just as a quick example, but I think the difference lies solely within the profit margin, where we have these mega corporations that you take a look at what they're spending versus what they're making, the profit margins are astronomical.
Mhm.
It's an astounding amount of money, and you look at that and you see, well, okay, you're charging over 100 some odd dollars. I don't know what the price of insulin is right now, but I'm sure it's still insanely expensive.
Yeah.
Versus they're making it for a single digit of dollars, and you have to ask yourself the question of like, do you really need to make this much money off of people that are just trying to maintain their health over the period of their lifetime? um, you can still make a decent profit and take care of these people under you without charging this astronomical amount of money.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, and then this also comes in where government regulation tends to hinder the kind of progress. The healthcare market itself is there's such a high bar for entry, whether it be for, and I mean to some extent understandably so, but I see it as there's a large amount of unnecessary red tape that if any new competitor wanted to come into the space and say, hey, we want to make affordable insulin so that people can have a better life, we want to be able to allow somebody with that idealistic mentality to come into the marketplace and take over and take on these companies that are purely profit driven and trying
Mm.
to extort for, well, not lack of a better word, that's exactly what they're doing. They're extorting the American people for their hard-earned money, um, and just so that they can take care of themselves and live a healthy life.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. Those are definitely really good points. I think that so there's a few things that I kind of want to discuss based off of that. I think the first one is in terms of profit motivations. Let's take healthcare specifically, since we talked a lot about that one. I think the big area in which I probably differ here that we could go on talking about for a little while is whether there should be a profit motive at all to certain things like healthcare. So I think when it comes to basic human necessities, I would consider that being healthcare, education, water, sewer, electricity, gas, things like that. I don't think there should be any profit motive to it whatsoever, and that it should be subsidized by the government through taxes. So that's where I think, and I know that we talked about earlier that compassion can't be compelled from the people like that, but there's a part of me that almost kind of disagrees with that. I think that it is the government's responsibility to cover those basic needs of the people, even if it is against the will of some. I think for the good of everybody, we need to make sure that everybody is covered there. So I don't think that there should be any profit motive at all to certain things like that. However, I would totally agree when it comes to all of the red tape that's surrounding so many industries that's preventing new competitors from coming in. The area that I know really well is the airlines, since I work in the airlines. And it's very difficult to start a new airline in the United States to have any sort of competition against the few big airlines that exist. Um, Sorry, I'm running out of breath here.
Oh no,
Um,
you're kidding.
but I think the big reason why, though, isn't even necessarily because of all the red tape that's existed since the deregulation of the airlines in the 70s. It's because of the slow conglomeration of airlines. You used to have 10 different major airlines in the United States that controlled the different parts of the country. And now it's just American, Delta, and United. If you're living in Atlanta, your only choice is to fly Delta pretty much. If you're living in Seattle, your only choice is to fly Alaska. Like you don't really have a lot of different competitive options. So I think the other area where I would disagree a little bit is not necessarily that it's the red tape that the government has put in place that's causing all of these issues and price gouging and things like that. I would say that it's the increasing monopolization. And that's where it's the government's job to come in and stop that, where trust busting needs to become more common again. And we need to have breakups of major companies like Apple, like Google. I think that would be really good for the American people. And I think that's the government's role to do so.
Now, oh, I just lost the point that I was going to bring up.
You're good.
Well,
Right.
I'll interject here real quick, because when it comes to healthcare, this is actually sort of a place that I feel like I lean a lot more towards, obviously the social safety net, and the thing is though, like, so I understand the argument that like there shouldn't be profit in healthcare because essentially then you're making money off of people being sick, right? And you're making money off of the next pill that you're just like whipping out just because. And this isn't to say anything about medicine because there's a lot of good prescription drugs and whatnot that help a lot of people, but I just think when the incentive is more profit driven, there's more motive to need to help people, I guess, rather than maintain. But at the same time, where I sort of like see I guess understand the free market here is, you know, we've certainly come up with a lot of these medical innovations because of a competitive free market. The newest the vaccine was a perfect example for COVID. I mean, I feel like there were a few different companies out there sort of trying to be the first and the best to get it rolled out. That competitive element essentially drove the need to, or drove the making of that.
Hmm.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I mean, if we're going to talk about, that's what I was going to bring up. So if we talk about government structure and corporate structure, I mean, we're talking about two structures that mirror one another, right? One's more legislative, one's more profit driven, but it's still made up of these individuals that could either be truly motivated by whatever cause they're working towards, or they're just motivated to further themselves. And I mean, not to talk down to that idea, I mean, all of us are slowly trying to move forward and move ourselves up as much as we can. But if
Mhm.
you're talking about an industry like healthcare, for example, that needs to be more compassion driven, I would agree that we do need some sort of social safety net on that side, but we also need to bake in the ability to opt out of such a system. What and the reason I say that is Social Security, the system as it currently stands, is not going to maintain its promise for, I mean, millions of aging Americans that we're going to that are moving into retirement now. Um,
Mhm.
they've paid into it throughout their lifetime with the promise that they were going to be taken care of when they're ready to retire, and now the money's not there because it's been gutted. um,
Mhm.
we need to have the ability to see that and say, "Oh, this isn't something I want to pay into." And it honestly needs to. We need to pull money away from other allocations. A good target for that would be like military-industrial complex,
Yeah.
um, and pay into the people that have already been promised their retirement, and then give the everybody else the option of, okay, is this something you want to pay into? Is this something you don't want to pay into? But then we need to have it set up on like individual retirement accounts, for example, of like what you're paying into it is what you're eventually going to get out of it.
Would you be on board with something like, because I voluntary tax idea actually, like, it really interests me. I think it's a cool idea. Um, I guess, would you be willing to, like, make sort of a limit or a bracket to some degree, to especially as a way to transition to where it's like, okay, you make above X amount, you are compelled to give, so that we can ensure these people who are making the poverty wages or whatever it is, do have things like healthcare and whatnot. Whereas if you make underneath that threshold, you now are in the category of voluntary taxes, where you can choose to put your money towards certain things.
So this is where I get some of the more strict libertarian ideology is going to come out. This is when we're talking about a voluntary tax system. It's going to be something that heavily leans on this ideal of compassion is not compelled; it's freely given. So you have this public tax system that you can choose whether you want to pay into or not, and deciding where you want your money to go. Um, the one thing that I would say that would be self-policing, as far as the people that are making more than others, and deciding that they're not going to pay into it, is that this open tax system is a public system, meaning all records are going to be public. So you're going to be able to see like which corporations, which rich individuals are paying and how much versus how much they're actually making. Um, and that is going to greatly influence like the rest of the population. If we figure out tomorrow that Walmart is not paying any taxes into this into this voluntary system, it's like, oh, we don't want to go shop there. We don't want to give these people our money. They're not returning it to us. They're not, they're not helping us out. They're only in it for themselves. So I'm gonna go shop elsewhere.
Okay. Um, I guess, though, just as a sort of, because I feel like either of these systems, if we end up getting there one day, it's gonna be a while. It's gonna be a long transition, and if it's even possible with the current structures that are standing. So I guess what I was getting at is that, like, as a slow start to the transition, would you be on board with, like, starting it at the poverty line? Like, okay, if you're making, like, at poverty line level wages, you don't have to pay taxes, but, for a little bit, I mean,
Mhm.
Essentially,
Yeah,
it's just like I want to make sure like our current system doesn't take care of people that well already. Um, but I don't see how people are going like there's going to be compassionate people out there. There already are donating to charities and all the above. Um, but I don't see how we could allocate enough. I guess you said we could pull some from the military, but yeah, I'm rambling a bit, so
Oh no, you're good. I argued where, well, I'm going to say this is probably where Josh and I are going to agree. We're going to have to slowly implement this kind of a system because you try to flip a switch like this. It's not like everybody's suddenly going to learn personal responsibility. They're going to learn compassion. They're going to learn love thy neighbor and betterment. Betterment of everyone else is betterment for yourself as well. This is going to be a slow moving, changing process that we have to focus on those sole concepts of compassion, of helping one another. Um, and I mean, we've had a good spiritual discussion before, Keaton,
yeah.
about how interacting with other people in your life and having compassion for others, helping others, fills your life with this joyful energy. um, I think that's something that we need to see implemented and baked into a system, especially that ideal of compassion and bettering one another. And um, I will say also, caveat to my own argument, is that you can't help others. You can't reach out and give compassion to others if you're not in a place to.
Yeah.
So that's where the I idea of individualism comes in, is making sure that you are in a good place. You're reaching out, you're asking for help when needed, and you're getting to a place where you're then able to exchange your time or exchange your money, however you're able to contribute and help others get to a place where they then can turn around and pay it forward.
Okay, so I've come to a more clear way to communicate what I want to say here. I think the problem is for me is that I would consider people who, and I'm not talking about people who are striving to be like, millionaires with a big nice house, whatever. We've sort of set that standard here, but I'm talking about the disgustingly wealthy people that could literally just burn their entire bank account in one area. To me, the people that accumulate the most wealth are sort of the least compassionate ones, because I don't think anyone who is that compassionate would ever want to have that much money for themselves and them than their family. They would have wanted that redistributed already.
Hmm. No, yeah, I would consider. I don't think anybody that gets that rich has played on a level playing field. They've had somebody in their pocket. They've had favors done for them. And even if you are able to get that rich, people have proven time and time again it's hard to stay that rich. Um, and I think they're playing some dirty games behind the scenes to maintain that wealth. That's where
Okay.
things like anti-lobbying legislation and oversight on that side of things comes in.
Yeah, which that sounds like something we all sort of agree on. Um, but again, I can't see in either of these systems how we would really prevent that. What what politician who's getting lobbied is ever going to push for a bill like that?
There is a Democratic. I don't know if he's running for Congress or Senate. Out of California has a 5-step plan. First of which is the anti-lobbying legislation. Um, that's somebody that I would love to see to make it to office, but that would be something that would need to be um, heavily exposed by, like, the media, for example, have a lot of media exposure so that we can put it out to the American people, especially when the time for the vote comes, of who voted yes and who voted no for wanting to take money from private corporations versus the people that want to do away with the system and actually serve the people that put them in office.
Well, so I actually have a friend. I don't know where he currently works, but he used to work, I think, under some sort of lobbying firm, something like that. He might actually be listening. So if you are, you should come on here and tell these guys what you think about anti-lobbying laws. It is interesting because it's sort of something that's been part of our system, part of the free market, I suppose, like since its birth, or is that incorrect?
I'm actually not sure on the history of lobbying.
Josh, do you know?
I personally don't know either. Sorry, I've been quiet for the last few minutes. I've been furiously scribbling a whole bunch of notes. So some of these ideas are actually somewhat new for me, especially the one of having to publicize whether people are paying into this tax system or not. That was very interesting to me. But to directly answer the question on lobbying and its history, I don't know, but it seems as though, especially since the Reagan era, that lobbyists have gained substantially more power than they used to have because just the amount that's being spent on campaigns has been exponentially increasing since that era. So I think lobbying has probably always played some sort of a role in like Smith's version of a capitalistic society. I think it's always been around in the US, but I think it's only been relatively recently that it's had as much power as it has.
I mean,
Okay.
there was a court ruling only a few decades ago that ruled corporations as individuals, right?
Citizens
Uh,
United, right? Is that it?
I think that's it.
Yeah.
So I mean,
Citizens
up until
United,
that point,
Glass-Steagall was another one.
mhm. I mean, up until that point, it must have been more of like an unspoken rule of no, like these giant corporations are not considered individual.
Hmm.
But then that's something that wasn't written into law and then subsequently exploited.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
So I'm kind
Yeah,
of
I don't
curious,
know.
Keaton, what your friend would have to say about anti-lobbying legislation. If you
Yeah.
could give us that Cliff Notes version.
Well, that's why I would hope he would come on because I'm not exactly sure. Um, I do know, like, because I used to sort of tout the opinion we need to have term limits and whatnot, right? That seems to have been sort of a buzz phrase that went around, and I was one of them saying it. And I said it to him, and he was like, that would make the money in politics worse, actually, because now you're just creating more space for more campaigns, um, and essentially more money to flow into those campaigns.
Hmm.
But yeah, sorry, I'm not sure exactly what he would say about that.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious. Like, I can see more campaigns, but they're uh, where we're at currently. There's with the two major party system. There's typically only two campaigns anyway. It would be the same amount of money just spread out over multiple campaigns, I would think.
Yeah,
Not like an not an exponential growth of spending in politics just because there's more and more campaigns.
yeah. I guess I could see it maybe being split evenly. But I think just the argument rests on essentially you're creating more competition, and where there's more competition and more campaigns, you might get more special interests and lobbying groups, getting involved.
Hmm.
But
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear what that argument would be.
he probably doesn't have the
Mhm.
balls to come on. I'll call him out.
Mhm.
I sort of want to try and push this along because god damn, we were already running out of time. I don't know how that went so fast, but I kind of felt like I targeted you, Dana, a little bit, and I wanted to ask Josh a couple things that I wrote here. And I know you've had
Yeah,
a
sure.
notepad filled already, Josh, but um So one thing I just wanted to mention, and you obviously know this because you work in, advocating for unions and whatnot, but
Hmm.
democratizing of the workplace can actually happen in a free market. So essentially, like, that's something that can exist without an overhaul of the entire system, I guess. Um, so as far as like the government structures, is this something that you would want governments to compel all businesses to run like this certain model of democracy?
That's a really interesting point. I mean, I would love to see a system like that, I think, because for me, I think though I'm a very huge union advocate and think that they certainly have a place in private enterprise, I think that it's merely a step to what we ultimately want to achieve. Because the unions are by no means perfect. They certainly have their problems, and negotiating periods can take years, which is more often than not the fault of the employer for just refusing to budge on a whole bunch of contract issues. So I think unions are definitely a step in the right direction. But until corporations become completely employee owned and the shareholder no longer has a say over what happens in the day to day runnings of the company, which most directly affects the lives of the employees, it's not going to be enough for me. So I think a union is certainly a step in the right direction, but it's not the ultimate answer for what I want to see. I think it's what's most likely for us to achieve in our lifetimes, though. So that's why I'm such a huge union advocate and union supporter. And why I think, especially in fields like transportation, it makes plenty of sense to have a union because you have such crazy work rules. Um, Whether it comes to the airlines or especially the railroads, there's a reason the Railway Labor Act exists. I yeah, I don't know. It's a good question whether or not the government should compel companies to have like a democratized workplace. Was that kind of your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say my short answer is yes, because I don't think that most corporations are going to willingly allow unions to happen. Almost every company right now that has a union campaign going on, take Amazon or Starbucks as the biggest culprits. They are fighting tooth and nail against these union campaigns at every single turn. Even though Amazon and Starbucks love to posit themselves as these very big, like left leaning corporations that really care about social issues, when it comes down to economic issues, they're very staunchly right wing and don't want to see the democratization of the workplace because they know it's going to mean lessened returns for the shareholders, which is going to put the C suite jobs in jeopardy. So I
Mm.
don't think there's going to be almost any company out there that's going to willingly do so. Therefore, I think the government will need to mandate it. So against the will of the employers. So just to put it very bluntly, yes.
Yeah. So you're bringing your authoritarian hammer down. I'm just kidding. Um,
I
so
mean,
actually,
in a sense, almost because there is like that's a really interesting point to bring up how much of a role authoritarianism needs to play in moving towards a communistic system. Because you can go in multiple directions when it comes to communism. You can go into the direction, like I was talking about earlier, of what the USSR or China did, which was a very poorly implemented communist system that I think Karl Marx would be rolling in his grave with seeing. Or you could go more in the direction of a place like Sweden, Denmark, most European countries that are going much more into regulated capitalism while still having a very strongly democratic system at the same time.
so one of the better arguments I've heard, sort of, for like socialism is kind of what you mentioned earlier, kind of this natural implementation of it, and it kind of has to happen from the ground up, the people getting involved, um and essentially like the democratizing of like the workplace um
Mhm.
is sort of the natural way for the people to start taking it into their own hands, I guess. But i I guess I still just question, like, because I could get totally on board with that, right? Sort of like the whole union pushes and things like that. But I guess um I don't know how it's going to translate to the government, the public sector after that. um I yeah, because just we can democratize our workplace. So then, do we just allow like, how would you move that into politics, I guess?
Okay, interesting. So, how would you essentially come to it? Like, are you talking about like unionizing government employees, or are you talking more about
Essentially,
how we're going
like,
to decentralize the government and make it into a more socialistic system?
yeah, because if we start naturally from the ground up and we're just democratizing our workplaces, and that's where we start. We don't even worry about
Mm,
legislation and politics necessarily. We're just like naturally doing this in our workplaces. Just
mm,
because I was thinking I think that's one of the better arguments for like letting it happen on its own. Um,
mm,
I'm just wondering where we bridge the gap from there. Say we have a bunch of corporations now that are unionized and a bunch of like all these businesses are sort of on board.
mm.
Where do we bridge that to our politics and governing?
I see. I see. Yeah. So I think this is something where you would need to see increased regulation eventually, because with greater unionization, that means that you're going to have more broad threats of strikes. You're going to see more sectors of the economy potentially be shut down, which could have ripple effects across the entire industry. Again, take the airlines, for example. The last time there was a flight attendant strike was back in the 1990s when American Airlines flight attendants went on strike. And that resulted in a flurry of government regulations to stop that from happening again, because it completely crippled the US aviation industry for a few weeks. So, and
Yeah.
we obviously don't want to see that happen, because that has a trickle down effect into every other part of the US economy. So I think you would need to see increased regulation in the sense that strikes need to be prevented, but not from the standpoint of preventing the workers from going on strike, from the standpoint of preventing the employers from creating the circumstances in which the employees would need to go on strike. I don't know if I said that in the best possible way, but basically, you need to have increased regulations around like what the employers are able to do and not able to do, to punish people who are in unions, to limit people's raises, stuff like that.
Yeah.
I think you would also need to see a system where the government would need to tie raises to inflation. There's a whole bunch of different things that the government would have to start doing, I think. So mostly it would come down to regulation, I think.
Okay. And I apologize. I don't think I very clearly asked that question. And
Oh,
I'm
sorry, that
like,
might be me just misunderstanding.
no. Your answer was great. I was just I'm like really dumb and ignorant about economics, you guys. So I should probably just
No, I
shut
am
the
too.
fuck up and let
Been
you
there.
guys talk about it.
No,
But
I do have a counter argument to that of where we're talking about these larger corporations like the airlines, for example, the conglomeration of the airline industry, meaning there's
Mhm,
less competition, which means in turn there's less jobs for people to jump to if they're not satisfied with their current workplace, right?
mhm,
But
yeah.
in the tech space, I've been introduced to this concept recently of a flight risk, where you gain so much skill within your workplace along with tribal knowledge that you
Mhm,
become invaluable to that company's operation.
mhm,
Um, if somebody else comes along with a better offer, you are now a flight risk.
mhm,
You're able to jump ship if needs be. That's where I think things like democratization, there we go, how to get that out, of the workplace
mhm,
comes in, of having that stronger competition, having more jobs available for people to jump to. Um, and granted, that's not going to be in we can't achieve the same thing in every sphere of work, but if we're talking about the tech industry, for example, it's one of the least regulated up until this point anyway.
mhm,
We are seeing some things taking action on AI, which I think are completely justified. AI is getting to a potentially scary place where it can be used maliciously.
mhm,
So there has to be an oversight there. But when it comes to the rest of the tech industry, it's been largely unregulated, and you see things like Google working 6-hour days, being able to take naps at work, just implementing
mhm,
all these little perks to keep their people happy and keep them from flying to other companies.
mhm. Mm. I mean, that's definitely a good point. So you're arguing essentially that a lot of good things can happen for employees through the free market system.
Hmm.
Okay,
And
okay, yeah. So, and
provided
I would agree.
provided that there is that strong competition, that we have 10 companies in the sphere, um, fighting for their market share versus 2 or 3.
Mhm. Yeah. And that again is where I think you and I might agree that there needs to be at least some amount of reasonable, decent regulation to prevent 1, 2, 3 major companies from completely taking over everything within the tech sector.
Now, I know that a friend brought up with me once upon a time. I can't remember the name of the specific company, but they were an aluminum provider. Uh, they actually had a monopoly on the aluminum market. And what you would think they wanted to do was raise the price and just start gouging people for as much money as they possibly could.
Mhm.
But what they ended up doing is keeping their prices low and um, eliminating the need for competition. So there's that like small argument that monopolies aren't necessarily a bad thing, but it is heavily dependent on the people at the helm, which
Mhm.
in my mind
Mhm.
kind of eliminates the argument altogether. But
Yeah.
there is that
Well, and that
example.
comes back to the oh, sorry, what was the last thing you said?
Oh, there is that example out there as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And I guess that comes back to the a greater question that I think Keaton especially would be really interested in is the moral argument of how much you can trust people at the helm to do things like that. Because sure, there can be the benefit of monopolies on that front, but I don't think most human beings are naturally going to do something like that. Most are going to price gouge when put into a position like that. At least, or at least many would. Maybe not most, but many people would. So I think the big problem that I hear talked about all the time with both a capitalistic system, with a free market system, or with a more communist or even democratic socialist system is the whole moral issue. So I kind of wanted to talk about that one a little bit more too and see how each of our systems can kind of overcome the human proclivity towards being evil, for lack of a better word, because we're seeing that right now in the US. We saw that in the USSR. What can our system do to prevent and kind of safeguard people from having those systems come into place?
Now that I would argue boils down to a question of and a heavily dependent learning on personal responsibility and consequences, right? Um,
Mhm.
in these failed systems of communism that we've seen in the East, there hasn't been a lot of there's been a lot of wrongdoing that hasn't been accounted for.
Mhm.
Um, Mao is a prime example of that. Stalin is a prime example of that. Somebody that you couldn't hold accountable because the ideal was placed so much higher than the well-being of the people that were around them. So
Mhm.
the they would preach these arguments of this is for the greater good. We need to do these terrible, awful things for the greater good. Um, but I'm sorry. Can you restate your question? I just completely lost track where I was
No,
going
no,
with
you're good. So I mean that's a great place to get started, I think. My question was basically how in and I guess I'm asking this question to myself as well. So I might go ahead and try to answer it in a few minutes too, but kind of like what can we do under capitalism, whether it's regulated or deregulated,
that.
to prevent people from uh, leaning into their natural proclivity of sometimes just being terrible people. What can we do under capitalism to make it as moral as possible and help as many people as possible? Because I think you and I would agree that we have different systems that we want to implement it in. We both want as many people as possible to be as prosperous and as safe as possible.
Mhm.
So what do we do to allow that to happen without having evil people come into positions of power and basically ruin it for the rest of us?
And if I could add just a little bit to this as well, for me, like this may be a bit too idealistic, but I also want to take care of the people who are not good at taking like responsibility. Say they're a addict, or don't spend well, or whatever it is. Like to me, that doesn't, I don't want to leave them behind. I still want a system that can catch them, sort of the whole safety nets that we're talking about, regardless of if you're just the laziest POS, whatever you're doing. I feel like the ideal system to me, regardless of what it looks like, should be able to support at least feed, house, and give healthcare to all people regardless.
That's going to come down to where I was going with personal responsibility. Um, we have to let people experience the consequences of their actions. So if we're going to go on the example of like a drug addict, for example, um, they we need to let people fail, but also we need to acknowledge that everybody is going to fail at some point in their life, and everybody's going to need some help at some point in their life. We can't have these things like three strikes you're out kind of a rule. It's like, oh, you messed up again. Here, let's try picking you up. Let's get you on your feet. Let's try to help you move forward. We have to have compassion for those people that are experiencing those consequences. So it's a little it's kind of a fine line to walk, I would say, because a lot of it, people have to take the responsibility upon themselves if they want to get better. In the terms of like a drug user or a drug addict, for example, um, they could receive all of the outside resources imaginable and still not want to make the effort to better themselves, to overcome their addiction, and they allow themselves to slide back into it. We've
Right.
seen this with celebrities, people that have millions and millions of dollars that are in and out of rehab and eventually die of a drug overdose because they don't want to take personal responsibility. They're bailed out. They use their money to bail themselves out. They're not experiencing the full weight of those consequences of those from the actions that they've taken.
Yeah,
Um,
and just to be clear, like, so I definitely agree with a lot of what you're saying, that we do have to let people sort of hit the ground on their face and then learn like how to get back up and move forward from there. And I don't think we just need to like sort of put everyone in our little nests and make sure that like all the time they're doing okay. I think that there's certain, essentially, because we're such a wealthy society now, I feel like there needs to now be new rights, what it means to be a citizen. The basic level of what it means to be a citizen is to be able to feed yourself, be able to, get yourself stitched up, even if you don't have money at a hospital, whatever it is, and have access to some sort of shelter. And that's it. Like, you don't get you still need money for your drugs. Like, you're still gonna have to go find ways to accomplish things. Essentially, you're not gonna have access to a yacht and a lake house, and and if that person doesn't care, if they'd rather just sort of have this basic necessity of the small shelter we provide, then they can live their whole life out that way.
mhm. And that comes down to, at least in my mind, a voluntary aspect of it. Of we have to come together as a group of individuals, for example, and say this is something that we want to do. So we go up, we buy a plot of land, we put small houses or like a large kind of housing facility to facilitate the most people possible.
Yeah.
But we're doing that out of our own compassion, out of our own life experience of falling on our faces and having to get back up again. But really quick, I wanted to take this analogy of drug addict, for example, and move it over to like a corporation. Those C-suite people that are in charge, when they start making decisions to better to line their pockets, to restrict how much their workers are being paid, or try and restrict the regulation of their when it comes to a safe work environment. Um, we have to hold them accountable for those actions. Like the people that are under them making them money have to be able to hold them accountable and say, okay, we're not working for you anymore. We're stepping away. We don't agree with the direction you're going. We don't agree with what you're trying to do. So we're not going to work for you anymore. And they need to feel the weight of those consequences hit them. They need to be in the position where they're gonna lose everything.
Yeah, this is like, honestly, these places right here, I actually feel are sort of where the systems are kind of overlapping in a sense. Sort of, you know, where the workplace kind of has this power to hold the highest earners accountable, right? And also sort of what you were saying about this voluntary idea of us getting together as individuals. You know, essentially that sort of is communism in a sense. Like, if we're getting together as a community of individuals and deciding how we want to redistribute our wealth in certain areas, that really is not a far swing away from communism. So it's interesting how the overlaps are showing here.
So one of the staunch libertarians' favorite arguments is that in a libertarian society, you can live as a communist or a socialist or however you so choose. But if I'm a libertarian in a communist society, I can't live the way that I want or live under the ideals that I would like to live. Now, I think they're referring to the more authoritarian communism that we see with the USSR, with
The
China.
failures,
Um,
not the ideal.
yeah, but they're referring to authoritarianism, not
Yeah.
communism, I would say.
Yeah. That's a really good point too. I think that you definitely can have, because this is going more in the direction of not what's the point I was trying to make here? I just had a great point in my head and it totally disappeared. But basically, what I was going to say is, I agree with that. I think that we can live in a system where you can have a pretty laissez-faire economic system where everybody is able to live and prosper together, but that only comes through going through a stage where the workers come to a point of controlling the means of production. And so I think that you would need to see the current systems eventually toppled in order to get to that place. But that's not what I was going to say. There was something else that was on my brain that I was going to say earlier, and I totally forgot. So I'll let you guys keep talking.
No,
Well,
I mean, speaking personally, one of my dream goals is buying up several acres of land and bringing people to get together in a small community in a place that I think the concept's called like a 5 minute or 10 minute city, where we can live in
Yes.
an area that we can ride a bike to the grocery store. Like everything is a 10-minute bike ride away from us. We're not living in
Mm.
these huge sprawling cities where we have square miles that are zoned only for residential and no corporate or um, no business can exist within those bounds. You have to drive
Mm.
several miles out of your way to go to a grocery store, to go to these other said businesses where, I mean, if we're talking about the early 1900s, everything was co-located together. There was no like giant restriction on where certain buildings could go or if a business could open up in a neighborhood, for example. And people were able to they were in the habit of just walking to the market every day. That's something that I think we need to that I would love to see brought back. But that's
Mhm.
something that I can do under like a free market system where I can buy into a plot of land with a group of friends or a group of people that have the same ideals as I do, and we can essentially build our own community. Um, hence, this is where the communism ideal comes in: is we're all coming together to um, provide the fruits of our labor for each other, not necessarily for profit.
and just sorry, Josh, I want to give you a good chance to say stuff. I know you've taken notes and whatnot.
Yeah, I've been spending so much more time writing than I have. Yeah,
uh,
sorry. This has been a lot of fun for me.
I'm gonna definitely give you the floor. I do want to say though, before we all take off here, there's just a couple things that I want to like end on, and get your guys' thoughts. But what I was gonna say is like sort of what Dana was talking about. This it's like this small time communism essentially, and the early Mormons did this. They had like a storehouse that they all put into and distributed out equally to the people in the compound. And when people say that there actually is no good idealistic version of communism in history, I actually disagree, because that was an example. Not only that, but the native people that were here beforehand also did a very similar type thing. Like, I don't think it was in their language to say it was communism, but they all were in relationship with the land, and they shared it, made sure everyone in their community was taken care of. The problem that happens with these communities, these perfect ideal versions of communism, is outside forces are spending money on military, and these guys always just get obliterated because they're distributing their wealth so well and sharing, um, that they don't necessarily need to like focus so much on military and defense, and that's when colonizers can come in and just sort of eradicate.
So this is where I would come in with the ultimate libertarian ideal of "don't tread on me," um,
Mm.
of hippity hoppity, get off my property.
Yeah.
Um, this is my argument for like a strong Second Amendment, for example, of being able to defend yourself from those outside forces, uh, whether they're uh, f- what's the best way to put it, lawfully going to eradicate you or not. You're fighting for your own existence at that point. Um, that's been a gross overreach on your right to life. So you have no other choice but to defend yourself at that point, right?
Right. Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, and I mean, I do still think sort of the outside forces, if they're taxing their people, like say like this is some weird hypothetical where you've now split from the country, Dana, and you're in your own little like city compound that you're talking about, right, where you guys are sort of self-sustaining yourselves. The outside forces that still tax their people, they're going to have a massively larger military than you, and essentially I don't think you would stand a chance as much as you would try.
My only hope that I would have there is that I make a very strong argument for maintaining an armory and maintaining military training and weapons training with those systems that we have. Um, because once again, I can't tell somebody else what's right for their life or what's right for their money or what have you. I can only try to convince them that, hey, there are these outside forces that may one day try to impede on our very right to exist. And I have to make a compelling enough argument that I can persuade everybody else within this community that no, we need to be prepared. We need to be ready to go in case this happens. But we can hope that it doesn't. But once again, hope for the best, prepared for the worst.
Well, I want to one day have another talk with you about my moral realism and my thoughts on objective morality, because I actually think you would really sort of like it. It's all based around the individual will and sort of consent and stuff like that. So we should chat about that sometime. And Josh, we're gonna shut up and let you go over all your notes.
No, this has been great. I think specifically from the last few minutes, what we've discussed about like the early Mormons and the Native Americans and communes and all of that stuff. I think I I do like those systems, but in my idealistic mind anyway, I would like to see this on a much broader scale. And so I know that one of the biggest arguments that I hear against communism whenever I bring up that word is, oh, it could never work here in the United States. It's just too big. So maybe it could work in a place like Sweden, in a relatively homogenous country, but it could never work in the United States. And that's an area where I disagree. I think that, again, like I was saying at the very beginning of the conversation, it needs to be a very slow implementation that happens over a period of years, perhaps even generations. It's something that we can do here in the United States, I think. And it's something that I think we could do on a broader global scale eventually. And so I think I would love to see a system like that. happen here in the United States. But what it's going to require is going to be changes to our educational system, changes in the way people view morality, changes to this idea of rugged individualism and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. I particularly like to look at kind of the comparison between Eastern and Western philosophy, and this kind of gets a little bit into religion, I suppose. I think Christianity is a very highly individualistic religion, especially Protestantism. It focuses very much on a personal relationship with Jesus Christ and all of that. Um, whereas in Eastern philosophy, like Buddhism, Hinduism, Shintoism, Taoism, it's a lot more focusing on the needs of the community. So I'm not arguing for like the abolition of Christianity in the United States or something like that, but I do think having a gradual shift towards talking more about the needs of the community impacting the individual rather than the needs of the individual impacting the individual, I think would be a very good place to start. So we need to have a fundamental shift in how we view each other in the United States and the good of everybody. I even noticed this in my customer service based job in the airlines is everybody is so focused on themselves and it's all they care about. They want to be the first ones to get off the plane whenever we have a delay, and they don't care about anyone else with their tight connections because they're the most important people on the plane. Like, I want to see a broader shift of that to an understanding of everybody on this plane matters, not just me. So we need to see that happen in the United States. And I think that's going to be the best way to eventually achieve a collectivistic system like we're talking about across the entirety of the US. Um, and then when it comes to a matter of self defense, well, if we're able to do that in the United States, we have the most powerful military in the world. So wouldn't have to worry about that as much. Whereas in a small commune system like this, the US government could run over us with tanks and drones almost immediately. Because if this poses any sort of threat to the corporations that control the government, then the US government will come right in and destroy it. So we need to see it happen on a broad scale. We can't It would be great to do it on a small scale. I would love to live in a system like that, but I want to see it happen on a much grander scale across the whole of the US. So that was kind of the big thing that I was thinking about for the last few minutes. And then the one other thing I wanted to talk about, out of the many, many things I wrote down, was the sustainability of growth. This could be maybe one last quick point to discuss. But I just think that part of the issue with capitalism that we have today is this constant need for growth at all times. And I would like to see a world in which growth is no longer the norm and no longer required, in which we have a sustainable model where the US population neither grows substantially nor shrinks. The average person has about 2.2 kids. That's about the replacement level that we need. And we don't have massive economic growth, but we have just enough to keep people happy. Um, that's what I would love to see in the US. I think it would be a much more sustainable model and it'll be good for climate change in the long run. So that's the other thing I wanted to say.
That's an amazing argument you just made for conservatism. So thank you for that. No, like for real though, like obviously not the conservatism that we see in our politics, but like
Okay.
like for instance, I'm taking a native class right now, actually, native philosophies, and so a lot of this like it's so interesting to relate to all this stuff. And actually, like a lot of them would a lot of native people would consider themselves conservatism because they want to conserve their traditional ways of life, of caring for the land, of caring for their community. And so it is interesting when you're looking at something like conservatism, is it can actually be a really good thing just depending on what you're trying to conserve.
Yeah. Instead of trying to conserve an ideology of imperialism and
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
colonialism.
And
exactly.
Western Enlightenment and Christianity and all that stuff that came with Western philosophy. And this is the other sort of point I wanted to make about it was, the natives here before the West invaded their philosophies were actually way more similar to Eastern philosophies, where it was more about the whole rather than the individual. And I think that there is an individual, like there's a space for the individual, obviously, because each individual needs to play their part for the whole. That's why I thought that this conversation would maybe naturally come up at some point too, because I think that both both outlooks are important, to focus on the individual's rights, but also to focus on the whole of the community. Um, but it and this sort of leads into like, so the couple things I really wanted to talk about before either of you left, the idea of land as the Western imperialism and colonizers have painted it. Um, it's basically been fictionalized as a commodity, right? Because a commodity is typically something that you produce and you put some sort of labor and effort into it or whatever, in order to sell that commodity. Whereas the land has been here before us, for like way before us. It was not produced by us, and that's sort of how the natives viewed it. They in fact they engage in a relationship with it. And Dana, you probably actually resonate with this a lot because of sort of your spirituality about certain plants and stuff. And so it's sort of like coming in here and commodifying land rather than it being another relationship that we all share as a whole, is sort of, I guess, detrimental first for the environment, but also in either of these systems. Essentially, what I wanted to propose is, if we took away income taxes, and sales taxes, I wonder what you guys would think on the idea of actually just doing a value of land based tax where sort of the land itself, rather than be treated for individuals' profit, it's treated as the societal good, the community, whatever the land can produce us profit wise, can go back into the system, I guess. And obviously not the work being done on the land, but like, just like I said, taxes for the property value.
Yeah, I kind of like that idea of because nobody idealistically, and when we're speaking about indigenous peoples, tribal peoples, um, there was far less population in the world than there is nowadays. But I love the ideal of we all can use the same space, we can use the same land, provided we just have respect for each other. Like I'm not just walking into your home, plopping down on the couch, and like, well, I just want to hang out here, and
Right.
just fully disrespect your space. But that just has to be a societal agreement of okay, we're nobody's able to own land per se, but we can still have some sort of boundary, um, and within reason. But I'm thinking, just with the population growth that we've had now, the easiest way that we've been able to accomplish any kind of boundary is through the sale of land.
Yeah.
Not that I agree with it, but that's how we've been able to do this up until this point. But I'd
Well,
definitely be
and
open to hearing arguments for other ways of implementing those boundaries.
yeah, and I think I agree that it's probably way too idealistic to just say like, oh, revert back to that way of life where we all just share the land. And I think there's plenty of natives in academia that also see that as not a practical approach to how to do this. But essentially, this is why I think the property tax would be the way. It's not about like, oh, we all now own this plot of land because the land's everyone's. It's now, oh, yes, this is still my plot of land, but based on the value and size of it, I pay back into my system that can redistribute the money in order for other people to have safety nets. And not only that, to help with the environmental stuff, this is actually something freaking Elon Musk, I heard him propose, is that you start taxing certain things that you don't want to be produced as much, certain things that release more carbon or start polluting the land. That starts getting put on a heavy tax because now you're trying to incentivize people not to do it, but also if they're doing it, we're getting some of that share in order to redistribute back to our people.
So it's kind of
Uh,
like a corporate sin tax almost.
Yeah, I guess so.
Interesting. Yeah. Mm, yeah. I like that idea, actually. I think that that would definitely be a good step that we could take in the right direction. And I would ultimately, of course, as a communist, I suppose, like to see a situation in which there is no private property whatsoever. But I think that's so hard for us to conceptualize as Americans here in the West that my brain can't even fully wrap itself around what a propertyless world might look like. So I think that this would be a great step in the right direction for sure.
Yeah, and see, this is where for me personally, like this is where communism gets too idealistic for me, I guess, because
Mm,
essentially I love that idea. And again, it seems like that was sort of the natural way of life in a lot of indigenous people's areas, like not even just in the Americas. There really wasn't a lot of this idea of like like there were still like people made things and traded but it was much more of a shared thing.
mm,
But I do think at this point, the influence that the Western philosophers have had, the influence that Christianity has had, I think that it may just be too idealistic. Um, and I think with the land based taxes, it's looking out for the poor people, the poverty line people, because you're not getting taxed on your income, you're not getting taxed on sales, and you're probably
mm.
not even getting a property tax because you probably don't really have the land value that you need to pay that tax.
and just going back to the base argument, I'm just thinking about how a tribal person would see this issue. I guess it would be like just the understanding that everybody has to have some kind of personal boundary, some kind of like safe space that they can have for themselves to retreat away from everybody else. Um, but I just see it as like they had small housing, like individual housing, um, with the understanding that once you step foot out that door, like you're not on your property, quote unquote. You're not in your space. You're out in everybody else's space. Um, so everybody would take like a small chunk for themselves and save the vast majority of the land to share with everybody else.
Yeah, yeah, and
And
I
I
think.
think that's just oh
Go
god.
ahead. I love
I
when
think
that
that's just
happens.
a oh yeah. I think that's just a concept or a mindset that like Josh was saying that's gonna take decades or generations to adjust.
Yeah,
Of we just need to put this ideal out there, let it sit with everybody else, and they need to decide for themselves if that's something they want to move towards.
yeah, and I think like I when I'm talking about like the them not really having this idea of personal property, like they certainly did, like yeah, like you said, they had their own space where they could go into their own place to reside. um but the idea and the priority was that it was a community and they all shared that land. And sort of part of that relationship with each other was the respecting of that space, right? It wasn't because that's like, oh, that's your personal property, I can't like cross this little boundary that we've drawn out. It was I'm not going to cross that boundary as a human because I understand our relationship to the point where like I know where I interact with you and I know where I like don't cross boundaries essentially.
Hmm.
Huh.
But well, Josh, you I know you want to take off here, so is there anything else you want to put on the table quick?
Yeah, well, let's see. So I do have to, I'm currently in the moving process right now, and I'm going to be have to going out in a few minutes here to go ahead and buy some more furniture. But I guess the last thing I wanted to say is I think, like always on this podcast, it's a really good learning experience. I feel enriched and enlightened every time I come on here, so I really appreciate that. Um, and I think, like what happens every time, we realize that there's more agreement there than the powers that be would like us to think that there is.
Yeah.
I think that there's this huge push, especially in the US, to divide people based on ideology as much as possible, when really we're much more united than a lot of people think. And sure, we have different ways of getting there, and we might even have some different end goals when it comes to things like private property, but we all are doing this out of a place of compassion and care for other people. And we genuinely want to see the best for everybody here in the country and around the world. And so I really appreciate that. But I think that's the last major thing that I want to say.
Cool. Um, so this is just one last thing that I just would suggest if you want to look into on your own, because it's have either of you heard of market socialism?
I have
I
not.
have not. No.
So it's I don't know a lot about it. I it's sort of a new thing I've been looking at, and essentially that's probably the best place where I would maybe put myself if I had to categorize. And really, from the way it sounds, it's exactly what it is. It is furthering, because pretty much every economy we see is mixed, right? Even the more socialist ones and the more capitalist ones will have a mix of both. Um, and I think the ideal of market socialism is something to the degree of we have a completely free market in most things, but yet we have a solid foundation of this social safety net for the basic things like I sort of listed off earlier. So yeah, I'm gonna do more reading onto it, and if you guys are interested, I definitely would recommend.
Yeah,
Interesting.
absolutely.
Okay.
And yeah, and Dana, if you I'm down to keep chatting for a bit too, if you had any other ideas or thoughts. Yeah.
I did just have one last thing to share. Just a personal experience that happened to me just a few weeks ago. I actually went out to Texas for a military reunion, meeting up with all the Marines that I had deployed to Afghanistan with in 2012. Um, and we had a surprise guest speaker come on Zoom and speak to all of us, and that was General James Mattis, or Chaos as he's known. Um, the biggest thing that he imparted to me that has really stuck with me and kind of had me thinking lately of my direction and where I'm going to go when it comes to interacting with the community or trying to make my community a better place is um, bringing the community back together. Um, in either of our ideologies, we're relying on this ideal that people can have different ideals but still get along. Um, but we're in this situation. We're in this country that um, any political dissent away from another individual's ideals is considered atrocious, or they're considered the enemy essentially. Uh, the biggest thing that he imparted to us and what we can do to start fixing things is bringing the community back together, realizing that these people that are on the far right and the far left, they're all Americans. They're all your countrymen, countrywomen. Um, these are all people that don't want to see the country destroyed. They want to maintain the freedoms that we've had. They just have different ideals on how we achieve that. And you don't have to hate them for that. There used to be this understanding that political ideals was just that. They were just ideals. They weren't these weird quasi-religious beliefs that we have nowadays, where if you disagree, you're fundamentally trying to bring down our civilization and everybody else with it. We need to start coming together as a community and realizing that we can have different ideals, but we can still work towards a same goal using compassion, using compromise, bridging the gaps on the things that we don't necessarily agree on, but finding somewhere to meet in the middle that would benefit them most.
Absolutely. That's exactly what I want this community to be. Like I seriously empathize with, like, even, you know, I literally talk to who I might consider Nazi adjacent and maybe even full blown, and you know, I because what else can we do other than descend into war, right? But the I will say, and Josh, like, if you want to say goodbye or anything, I don't know if you're hanging because you want to or because you feel like you need to say goodbye.
It's a mix of both. I do have to be in Layton by 5 o'clock, so I should probably go ahead and get going. But
I'll let
I'll
you
go ahead
say.
and I'll go ahead and listen to the rest, but at a later point. But just wanted to say again, thank you so much, guys. This was a really great experience.
Yeah, thank you,
Absolutely.
Josh.
It was good meeting you.
Yes, nice meeting you too. I'll talk to you guys later.
All right, see ya.
All
See ya.
right, bye.
I that's exactly what I advocate for. And the only place where I sort of disagree with the concept politically, and maybe I should be a little less firm about this, I guess, because we need to eventually pull everyone along. We can't sort of leave just the reactionaries in the dust, right? I mean, they're at the end of the day, they're people too, and a lot of their ideology is very terrible and hateful, but I don't think it's necessarily their fault. They've sort of just been convinced of these bad ideas. But I guess what I was trying to say is that where I take a more firm stance is the civil liberties. That's if people genuinely are saying things like, no, gay marriage was a slippery slope. Look at all the transness now, blah, blah, blah. We can't allow this degeneracy. That's sort of where I'm like, okay, like, no, you don't belong in my community if you're going to act like that towards, people that I care about or whatever, and be hurtful, I guess.
And speaking from a libertarian's point of view, that's a direct impedance on a person's pursuit of life, liberty, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's a direct infringement upon their rights. People, they're trying to implement religion,
Right.
and that flies in the face of any ideal that we've ever had of liberty. You can't tell somebody what is right and wrong for them to do within their life if it doesn't affect you whatsoever. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, I would say that's where we get into the libertarians' ideal of what actually constitutes a crime. Is has anybody's rights been infringed? Has anybody been hurt? And that is, like I was saying, a direct infringement of those people's rights.
Yeah. To sort of, like, I guess, try to roll back like gay marriage or whatever. That's the infringement that you would say.
Absolutely. And that's something where we have to come together as an American people and say, no, that's not what we want. And obviously, not everybody agrees with that. But it's like you said, there's a lot of people that are convinced that they have to be forced. Like, people have to be forced into the way that they think, or the way that these I was going to mention the this rise of Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
That absolutely scares me to death, because
Right.
they have shown time and time again that they don't care about individual rights. They care about implementing their religious rule, which
Right.
would set us back decades,
Well,
centuries.
and I'm sure that's super frustrating as someone who's served. I don't know your whole experience, but I've heard other testimonies of veterans that have been like, I just spent like a decade fighting religious extremism, and here I am in my country sort of staring it down the barrel again, and it's kind of I guess frustrating.
Exactly. Like, it's not going to be too much longer before you see the rise of Christian extremism in the way that we've seen Islamic extremism rise in the Middle East,
Yeah.
where people are going to take these ideologies to the point where it's convert or die. And that's something that's absolutely intolerant, like, cannot be tolerated. Um, because once again, coming back to the libertarian lingo, you are directly infringing upon people's lives, right to life at that point, because you're threatening those lives. Um, like, we just saw this happen in Israel with the Hamas attacks. Um, like,
Yeah.
extremism is very much the slippery slope.
Well, and
That's where
true. What's so frustrating too about this is, I'm sure this has been frustrating for you at some point, is um, a lot of the propaganda for this reactionary type movement is really based on a lot of projection. And essentially, they will co opt things like "don't tread on me" and reverse the victimization to say that, oh, gay people get to exist out in public in front of me and in schools. Now I'm the victim and you're treading on me. And so they sort of co-opt things like that. They reverse what it means to be a groomer, because that was always a religious term, like as someone grooming their children, right? And now they're projecting that onto that's what's so frustrating about it for me.
Yeah, no, the people that claim this "don't tread on me" because you're living the life that you want to in front of me do
Yeah,
not understand liberty.
right.
These are authoritarians in sheep's clothing, so to speak.
Yeah.
They don't believe that people should live. Uh, they don't believe in the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They believe in their own ideology, and that their own ideology is better for everybody
Right.
because that's what resonates with them. So therefore, that's what must resonate with everybody. Um, and I think this is what Josh was getting at with his talk about everybody being the most important person, being the center of the universe, so to speak. Um, this is where we have to, and this is where my spiritual side starts to come in. I've actually recently been able to put a name to it. It's pantheism.
Oh,
Um,
nice. Do you know what's cool?
Mhm.
I consider myself a naturalistic pantheist, so
Oh, that's a okay.
we're actually probably fairly similar in metaphysical views, just
Mhm.
big difference on the supernatural aspect, I think.
But I mean, this can also apply to Christianity. Like, if you believe that we are all children of God and He loves us all as we are, even though we're not perfect, then like what gives you the right to suddenly say, "Oh, you can't live how God made you because I say so, because you need to follow my church's ideals."
Right. Well, and
Like
they would
that's
say,
that's
a lot of
go
them
ahead.
would say that, yeah, I mean, that's not how God made you, right? You're sort of engaging in sin. And so, anyway, we don't need to go down that too far, but
Mhm.
it's cool because, like, yeah, this is the root of Christian ideology. It's a root of Judaism. Like, their main focus for ethics and society is seeing God in all humans. Like, they are all created in the image of God. That's why you do see a lot of Jewish people sort of advocating for these progressive civil values.
hmm Um, and I mean, speaking from the pantheist point of view, like we are all God, we are all the universe, all just incarnated into our individual forms. But when we're interacting with each other, we're interacting with ourselves, and that's where the greater sense of community comes into this.
Right.
Realizing that a strong community around you means that you are strong as an individual, but that also happens vice versa. Um, with the concept of like you are only as strong as your weakest link. Um,
Essentially, your argument for community is the absolute tolerance of the individual is what makes the community, essentially. Just allowing everyone in the community to be their own individual is the community.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that's a concept that is lost to these Christian nationalists
Yeah.
that you see.
Yeah, and it was
Like
foundational to our original country. Not only that, it was super. This is a huge philosophy in a lot of indigenous thinking. This sort of, they in fact they made a what it was called a two-row treaty with the Dutch, like, early on.
mhm,
And it essentially was inviting to the Dutch people and was like, we're going to sign this treaty and share this land. And the metaphor was, we're gonna row down the same river in two separate boats. We're gonna be rowing parallel to each other and living alongside in our own ways.
Exactly. That's coexistence. That's how we move forward. We need to get rid of the secularism. We need to get rid of this ideal that I'm right, you're wrong. That's never the case.
Wait, hold on. So when you say get rid of the secularism, what do you mean by that?
Well, just like there's this strong us versus them mentality that we have, no matter where you are on the political spectrum. I mean, if you're in one of the two mainstream ideologies currently, there is blatant us versus them. Like
Right,
Republicans are ruining the country, Democrats are ruining the country.
right.
Republicans want to see the end of freedom. Democrats want to see the end of freedom. Like that mentality, and this is one of the big points that General Mattis spoke on. Uh, we need to get rid of that idea that these people that are living to our right and to our left want to see both boats burn. To use your analogy,
Yeah.
we need to come to the understanding of like, no, we all just want to live our lives, do the things that make us happy, while with the limited time that we have here. Nobody's out to get you. Nobody's trying to destroy you. Like
Well,
it's
yeah, I think what I'm confused about is maybe your idea of secularism, because secularism essentially is just like non-religious or non-spiritual, right?
yeah, that may have been a bad use of words on my part. What would you call that?
Oh, okay.
Like a um
Partisanship,
it's like
maybe.
partisanship. That's a better one. Yes,
Yeah, agree to that
partisanship.
fully. And well, and it's like I'm not even even if you were sort of coming at secularism, I'm not really offended even though I myself am secular. It's actually interesting. Secular government stems directly from the sovereignty of God. Uh, because secularism is like quite literally adjacent to Christian theocracy and monarchies. Um,
Mhm.
and I think you'll actually really like this idea. So like the idea um, that sort of living with the land and indigenous people have is that, God is in creation. It's part of us. It's part of our relation. God, the creator, is here with us essentially, right?
Mhm.
Whereas these Western monotheistic religions came along and were like, God is alien, external to our world, and he has the ultimate sovereignty and divine authority. Oh, and now he's also granting it to his closest leaders, who are going to be the kings and the rulers in these theocratic governments. So it's such a different view of authority. Um, giving dominion over the land to essentially do as you please with it. Um,
Mhm.
and so this is where secularism is adjacent to it, is because, yeah, maybe we've gotten rid of the theocracy. Well, it's on the rise again,
Oh yeah.
um, but even in a secular world, we still have the government is now the sovereign divine authority, or whoever, has the most money. Maybe not the government is the right word, but
Yeah. But and that's kind of where my ideals about divine authority. Um, well, I would say my ideals of divine authority is the divine comes from within, right?
yeah.
Um, like you have to see what resonates with you, what ideals resonate with you, especially when it comes to spirituality, religion. But it's always an internal pursuit. It's an internal exploration of yourself and your thoughts, your ideals, what um, your cumulative being has become. Um, that's that's where I think divinity lies, and maybe that's why I'm so more leaning towards like this ideal of supporting the individual on an individual, like over over community, I guess you could say. Not necessarily over community, but this individual focused mindset that I have.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting dynamic because I think you can't have one without the other, really. So it's like they're both sort of on equal playing fields, but I think what you're getting at is the strategy for the overall community lies within the individual first. Even though they might be on even playing fields of importance, the strategy to get there is to sort of, this live and let live strategy, I guess.
Exactly.
Do you how much time you got? I don't want to hold you for too long.
I should actually. These two just showed up with the toolbox that I need to go help them unload. So
Cool. Well, have fun. Are you still digging stumps out, or are you done with that?
no, we're done with that for the day. We just got the ones dug out that we need to trench, and yeah, we're actually gonna hold ceremony later tonight. So
Cool. Hell yeah, man. Well, I definitely appreciate you coming. It's been a great discussion, I think.
absolutely, and I'm definitely looking forward to part 2.
Yeah. Hell yeah. All right. Take care, man.
All right, have a good night.
All right. Bye.